The hidden battle for food in World War II. Imagine this. A soldier crouches in a muddy trench, bullets slicing the air above his head. His rifle is heavy, his boots are soaked, and his stomach growls louder than the distant artillery. He reaches into his pack, not for ammunition, but for food. A dented tin can, a hard biscuit, maybe a piece of chocolate. In that moment, survival isn't just about dodging bullets. It's about finding the strength to take another breath, to march another mile, to fight another day. World War II was fought with tanks, planes, and battleships, yes, but it was also fought with bread, beans, rice, and canned meat. Armies didn't just compete on the battlefield, they competed in kitchens, supply lines, and ration depots. Feeding millions of men scattered across continents was a war within the war, a hidden struggle that decided who could endure and who would collapse. This was the unseen battle of rations.
Chapter 1: The State of Greece from the earliest times to the commencement of the Peloponnesian War. Thucydides, an Athenian, wrote the history of the war between the Peloponnesians and the Athenians, beginning at the moment that it broke out, and believing that it would be a great war and more worthy of relation than any that had preceded it. This belief was not without its grounds. The preparations of both the combatants were in every department in the last state of perfection. A war of calories and logistics. From the very first days of the conflict, military planners realized that a soldier's most powerful weapon was not always his rifle. It was his stamina, and stamina depended on calories. Millions of men needed to eat every single day, whether in the deserts of North Africa, the frozen forests of Russia, or the steaming jungles of the Pacific. But food was not simply food. It had to be designed for war. It had to last months in warehouses, survive the jolting of trucks and the damp of trenches, and still provide enough energy to march, dig, and fight. It was not about taste or luxury. It was about survival, logistics, and morale. The Americans built lightweight boxed meals, the famous K-rations, that could fit in a soldier's pocket. The British clung to tins of meat and packets of tea, because a hot brew could restore more spirit than any weapon. The Soviets handed out black bread and thin cabbage soup, enough to keep a man alive, but rarely satisfied. The Germans marched with rye bread and sausages, until shortages left many hungry. And the Japanese clutched bags of rice, the food of their culture, but often not enough to fill empty stomachs. More than just food, meals were more than calories, they were symbols of home. A piece of chocolate reminded an American of his mother's kitchen. A tin of bully beef made a British soldier feel connected to tradition. A handful of rice carried centuries of meaning for a Japanese infantryman. And when rations ran short, morale collapsed. Food shaped battles as much as weapons did. Hungry soldiers lost their will. Starving armies lost wars. In World War II, rations weren't just about eating, they were about endurance, loyalty, and the will to fight on. But how did these meals really look? What did they taste like? And how did they change from the beginning of the war to the bitter end? The answers reveal not just the story of soldiers, but the story of entire nations. Rations of the Allies. Feeding millions across the globe. Picture this. It's 1942, and the United States has just entered the war. In Europe, Britain is holding on under the Blitz. In the East, the Soviet Union bleeds under the German invasion. And across all these fronts, one question repeats itself daily. How do you feed millions of men every single day without fail? The Allies faced a challenge unlike any in history. Never before had armies stretched across so many continents, oceans, and climates. Soldiers needed food in the frozen Arctic, the burning Sahara, the jungles of Burma, and the hedgerows of France. And this food couldn't just appear. It had to be farmed, processed, preserved, shipped, unloaded, cooked, and delivered, all while enemy submarines prowled the seas and enemy planes bombed supply lines. Winning the war, in many ways, meant winning the war of logistics. And at the heart of that struggle were rations. America, the arsenal of food. The United States quickly became the undisputed food supplier of the Allies. American farms produced in staggering quantities corn, wheat, beef, pork, milk, and canned goods by the millions. Factories churned out preserved food that could survive months at sea. American soldiers carried K-rations and C-rations, designed for different situations. K-rations were compact meals meant for short combat missions, while C-rations came in tins and offered more variety for longer periods. Each box was calculated roughly 3,000 calories a day to keep a soldier going through exhaustion and stress. But American food didn't just feed Americans. It crossed the Atlantic in convoys, dodging German U-boats to sustain Britain. It was flown across the Himalayas to China. It went north to Russia through the Lend-Lease program, where tins of American Spam became a staple for the Red Army. For many Allied nations, U.S. food became the backbone of survival. Britain. Fighting on an empty stomach for Britain, the war meant sacrifice. As an island nation, Britain depended heavily on imports. German submarines targeted supply ships, sinking thousands of tons of food before it even reached port. The British government responded with strict rationing at home and in the military. British soldiers often received bully beef, canned corned beef that became infamous for its toughness and monotony. Alongside it came hard biscuits, tinned vegetables, and, above all, tea. Tea was sacred. No matter how bad conditions became, a hot mug of tea could lift morale and bring comfort. But the shortages were real. Soldiers grumbled about the lack of variety, and civilian rationing meant families back home were eating little better. For many British troops, the best meals they had were when they received American supplies through joint operations. The Soviet Union bred an endurance. If American rations were designed by science, Soviet rations were designed by desperation. For the Red Army, food meant survival in its most basic form. Black bread, often made with whatever flour was available, was the foundation. To this, soldiers added thin cabbage soup, potatoes, or kasha, a porridge made from grains like buckwheat. Meat was rare. Sugar was almost a luxury. And alcohol, especially vodka, sometimes replaced food as a means of endurance. Soldiers scavenged constantly, pulling food from abandoned villages, bartering with civilians, or even eating horse meat when supplies failed. Yet somehow, through sheer resilience, the Soviet soldier endured. Food may have been poor in quality and quantity, but the Red Army fought on it and, in time, pushed the Germans back. Feeding the world, when you step back, the contrast is striking. The Americans had variety, the British had tradition, and the Soviets had survival. Yet all were fighting the same war, often side by side. And this was just the beginning. As the war dragged on, innovation in rations, and the lack thereof, would shape not only the outcome of battles but the lives of the men who fought them. But how exactly did these innovations taste to the soldier on the ground? And what made the American K-ration such a symbol of wartime food? The next chapter reveals the details of the rations carried into combat, the meals that sustained soldiers under fire. American K-rations and C-rations. Innovation on the front lines. A soldier crouches in a foxhole in Normandy, rain dripping onto his helmet. He pulls a small cardboard box from his pack, tears it open with frozen fingers, and stares at what's inside. A packet of biscuits, a tin of cheese, a piece of chocolate, some powdered drink, and, if he's lucky, a few cigarettes. This was the K-ration, the lifeline of the American soldier on the move. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't a feast. But it was compact, portable, and, above all, designed to keep a man alive when he was far from supply kitchens. For millions of U.S. soldiers, the K-ration and its bulkier cousin, the C-ration, became the taste of war. The birth of the K-ration was the brainchild of Dr. Ansel Keys, a nutritionist tasked with creating a lightweight, high-calorie meal for soldiers in combat. Keys believed that a small box containing about 3,000 calories could sustain a soldier for a day. The ration was designed to fit into a pocket, easy to carry on marches or during combat missions. Each K-ration came in 3 parts: breakfast, dinner, and supper. A typical breakfast box might include biscuits, canned ham and eggs, instant coffee, chewing gum, and a fruit bar. Dinner might have canned cheese, crackers, lemonade powder, and candy. Supper often included meat or beans, biscuits, and another drink mix. Cigarettes were almost always included, since smoking was considered as essential to morale as food itself. On paper, the K-ration was brilliant. In practice, it had flaws. Soldiers complained the meals were monotonous, too small, and sometimes barely edible after weeks of the same menu. Many frontline troops lost weight living on K-rations for extended periods. But when supplies ran thin, it was better than nothing, and often nothing was the alternative. C-rations. The heavy tin diet. If K-rations were the lightweight option, C-rations were the standard field meal. These came in metal tins, heavier but more filling. Each ration consisted of several cans, one with meat, such as beef stew, hash, or beans with franks, another with bread or crackers, and smaller tins with coffee, candy, or fruit. Unlike the neatly boxed K-ration, C-rations felt more like an actual meal. Soldiers could heat the cans over a small fire, giving them something warm in freezing conditions. But again, monotony was the enemy. Eating meat hash for weeks turned even the hungriest soldier's stomach. Many joked that C stood for constipation. Yet, compared to what many other armies endured, C-rations were still a luxury. American industrial might meant that even in remote jungles or desert outposts, soldiers could expect food, however uninspiring, to arrive. The soldier's verdict: ask any World War II veteran about K or C-rations, and you'll likely get a grimace. Soldiers grew sick of the constant repetition. The same biscuits, the same tins, the same powdered drinks. Many traded rations with each other, swapped with civilians, or even tossed parts away. Still, rations carried psychological weight. Chocolate bars reminded men of home. Cigarettes calmed nerves. Even chewing gum gave soldiers something to do during long marches. Food wasn't just about calories, it was about connection to normal life, to sanity. And when American rations were shared with allies or even prisoners of war, they often became a symbol of abundance compared to the meager meals other armies endured. Innovation in a box. The K and C rations may not have been perfect, but they set the stage for modern military meals. Portable, calorie-counted, scientifically designed, and mass-produced, they were the blueprint for the meal, ready-to-eat MREs, still used by soldiers today. But how did America's abundance compare to Britain's struggle? While U.S. troops grumbled about monotony, British soldiers faced something more severe: scarcity. And yet, even on the bleakest days, the British Army clung to one ritual above all: tea. British soldiers and the taste of home under rationing. The morning mist clung to the hedgerows of Normandy. A British soldier, weary from days of combat, reached into his kit bag. Out came a battered tin of corned beef, bully beef, and a packet of hard biscuits that could chip a tooth if not soaked. Nearby, a kettle hissed quietly over a small fire. When the first sip of tea touched his lips, he sighed. For the British Army, no matter where they were fighting, from the deserts of North Africa to the hills of Italy, tea was not just a drink. It was a lifeline to home. Food was never abundant for Britain's soldiers. Unlike America, which had vast farms and factories, Britain relied heavily on imports. And those imports faced a constant threat: German U-boats. Every ton of food that crossed the Atlantic was a gamble, and thousands of tons never made it. As a result, British rations were simpler, plainer, and often scarcer. The standard soldier's ration a typical British soldier during World War II might receive: bully beef, corned beef in tins, hard biscuits or bread when available, tinned vegetables or powdered potato jam or margarine, tea and sugar, always included if possible. The reliance on bully beef became so extreme that soldiers joked they'd eaten more cows from Argentina, where much of it was canned, than they ever had in England. The meat was salty, tough, and monotonous. But it was reliable, it lasted long and filled empty stomachs. Biscuits were another staple. Hard, dry, and nearly unbreakable, they often required soaking in tea or water just to chew. When bread was available, it was welcomed like a gift, though it rarely stayed fresh for long on the front. Comfort in a cup. For British troops, tea was sacred. It wasn't just caffeine, it was morale. A hot cup of tea, brewed even under fire, gave soldiers a moment of normality. In fact, military planners made sure tea was always prioritized in supply chains, even when food was short. Soldiers brewed it in mess tins, over petrol stoves, or even in helmets turned upside down. Tea breaks became a ritual. In the middle of chaos, a steaming mug linked men to home, family, and the sense of being British. The problem of scarcity: unlike the Americans, British soldiers often felt the sting of scarcity. Rations were limited not just on the front lines but back home in Britain. Civilians lived under strict rationing. A few ounces of butter a week, limited sugar, and 1 egg if lucky. Soldiers at least had priority, but they were far from feasting. As the war dragged on, fatigue with bully beef and biscuits set in. Soldiers bartered with Americans whenever possible, eager to trade their tea for U.S. chocolate, gum, or canned meat. Improvisation in the field, British ingenuity often filled the gaps. Soldiers would mix jam into biscuits to soften them, fry bully beef with whatever vegetables they found, or stretch tea leaves far beyond their intended use. Improvised stews, soups, and even makeshift puddings appeared when soldiers had access to local markets or captured supplies. This adaptability kept morale alive, even when the official ration box offered little variety. More than just hunger, the British soldiers' diet reflected the national struggle. Limited, stretched thin, but sustained by tradition and resilience. The food may have been dull, but the spirit it supported was unbreakable. But while British soldiers fought hunger with tea and bully beef, their allies in the East endured an even harsher reality. For the Soviet soldier, food was not just plain or repetitive, it was a daily fight for survival. Soviet soldiers, bread, soup, and survival in the East. It is winter, 1942. Snow whips across the ruined streets of Stalingrad. A Red Army soldier crouches in the rubble, rifle frozen in his hands. His stomach twists with hunger. From his coat pocket, he pulls a piece of black bread, hard, stale, and barely bigger than his palm. He chews slowly, stretching each bite, because he doesn't know when he'll eat again. For millions of Soviet soldiers, this was the taste of war. Survival, nothing more. The Soviet Union did not fight with abundance. It fought with resilience. Food was short, supplies unreliable, and yet the Red Army endured one of the harshest military diets of the war. Bread, the foundation of survival. Bread was the heart of the Soviet ration. Soldiers received daily allocations ranging from 400 to 800 grams, depending on availability. But in desperate times, rations dropped to just 200 grams or less. The bread itself was often dark, heavy, and mixed with whatever fillers were available. Sawdust, ground-up peas, even potato skins. For many Soviet soldiers, bread was not just food. It was life. A crust of bread could mean the difference between marching forward or collapsing on the road. The thin soups of war. Beyond bread, soldiers were issued watery soups, shkai, cabbage soup, barley soup, or potato broth. Meat was rare, often limited to a few scraps of pork fat, horse meat, or preserved fish. Vegetables like cabbage, onions, and potatoes bulked up meals when available, but shortages were constant. Field kitchens tried to provide one hot meal a day, but in frontline combat, even that was a luxury. Many soldiers boiled whatever they could find. Wild grasses, tree bark, or even leather straps, just to quiet the gnawing hunger. Meat, sugar, and vodka. Officially, Soviet rations included meat, sugar, and fats, but shortages made these items rare. When available, pork fat salo was treasured, as it provided much-needed calories and could be eaten raw, fried, or spread on bread. Sugar was rationed in grams, carefully weighed out and often dissolved into tea. And then there was vodka. Issued in small daily portions, vodka became both a morale booster and a survival tool against the cold. Some soldiers claimed it was the only thing that kept them standing in the bitter Russian winters. The hunger of the front. Hunger was constant. Soldiers scavenged food from abandoned villages, bartered with civilians, or raided German supply lines whenever possible. Horses, vital for transport, were sometimes slaughtered for meat. Even rats and stray dogs became food in the worst situations. The siege of Leningrad illustrated the extremity of Soviet hunger. Civilians survived on bread mixed with sawdust, wallpaper paste, or boiled leather. Soldiers at the front fared only slightly better. And yet, despite this deprivation, the Red Army fought on through hunger, cold, and exhaustion. Strength in hardship. For Soviet soldiers, food was rarely about taste or variety. It was about survival and determination. Each scrap of bread carried the weight of sacrifice. Each spoonful of soup was fuel for another battle. compared to the rations of the Americans and British, Soviet meals seemed pitiful. But the men who ate them fought with an iron will, pushing the Germans back step by step until the tide of war shifted. Still, hunger was not unique to the Soviets. As the war dragged on, even the once well-fed German Wehrmacht faced growing shortages. The soldiers of Hitler's armies began their campaigns with abundance, but ended in hunger, just like their enemies. German Wehrmacht, from abundance to starvation. June 1941. German soldiers march eastward, boots pounding the dusty roads of the Soviet Union. Their packs are heavy, but not just with ammunition. Inside are rations that, compared to most armies of the time, look almost luxurious. Dark rye bread, sausages, tins of meat, even coffee substitutes. At the start of the war, the Wehrmacht was one of the best-fed armies in the world. But this abundance would not last. As the war stretched on, supply lines broke down, resources dwindled, and the mighty German war machine found itself starving in the snow. The story of German rations is a story of decline, from plenty to desperation. The early war diet in the campaigns of 1939 to 1941, German soldiers carried generous rations. A standard daily allotment included 750 grams of bread or 500 grams of hard biscuits, 200 to 250 grams of meat or sausage fat, butter, or lard for cooking, coffee substitute, made from roasted barley or chicory, sugar, jam, and sometimes cheese. In addition, soldiers often enjoyed tinned meals, like Eintopf, stews of beans, peas, or lentils with meat. On the march, field kitchens, nicknamed the Gulaschkanone or goulash cannon, followed the troops, serving hot meals whenever possible. Compared to the Soviets and even the British at times, the German soldier ate well in the early years. The decline on the Eastern Front, but when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, the sheer size of the front created a logistical nightmare. Supply lines stretched hundreds of miles, trucks broke down in mud and snow, and food spoiled before reaching the front. Soldiers who began with sausage and bread soon found themselves living on half rations. German planners assumed they could live off the land, taking grain, livestock, and vegetables from conquered territories. At first, this worked. Villages were stripped bare, fields harvested, and food requisitioned. But as the war dragged on, and the Soviets adopted scorched earth tactics, supplies dried up. By the winter of 1941, German troops around Moscow were starving. Ersatz. The age of substitutes. As shortages worsened, Germany turned to ersatz, substitute foods. Coffee made from acorns, bread mixed with sawdust or ground up straw, margarine made from chemical fillers, meat replaced by turnips or soy meal. Soldiers quickly realized these foods filled the stomach but offered little strength. Complaints grew. Letters from the front described bread so dense it broke teeth, and stews so thin they offered no nourishment. The once well-fed Wehrmacht began to waste away. Starvation and desperation. By 1943 to 44, especially on the Eastern Front, many German units lived on whatever they could scavenge. Horses, once vital for transport, were slaughtered for food. Soldiers foraged in abandoned villages or raided local farms. In besieged positions like Stalingrad, rations dropped to as little as 200 grams of bread a day. Men grew weak, disease spread, and morale collapsed. Prisoners of war recalled German soldiers begging for American chocolate or British biscuits when captured. The contrast between Allied abundance and German shortages was stark. From luxury to hunger, the story of the Wehrmacht's rations mirrored Germany's war. In the beginning, strong, organized, and full of resources. By the end, desperate, crumbling, and starved of everything needed to survive. Food, or the lack of it, became one of the silent forces that broke Hitler's armies. But Germany was not alone in suffering shortages. Across the seas in Asia, Japanese soldiers faced their own struggle. Their diet was built around rice, but when rice ran short, hunger stalked them too. Japanese soldiers and the struggle for rice. A humid jungle night in Burma. Japanese soldiers sit silently under palm leaves, rifles propped against trees. Their uniforms are ragged, their feet blistered, and their bellies empty. From bamboo containers, they scoop out small portions of boiled rice, sometimes mixed with dried fish or pickled vegetables. The rice is plain, sticky, and far from plentiful, but for the Imperial Japanese Army, it is more than food. It is identity. It is survival. Unlike their American or German counterparts, Japanese soldiers were not supplied with varied rations. Their diet revolved almost entirely around rice. For centuries, rice had been the cornerstone of Japanese culture, and even in war, the military clung to it as the mainstay of the soldier's meal. But rice, though symbolic, was heavy, difficult to transport, and prone to spoilage in humid climates. As the war expanded, Japanese soldiers often faced long stretches of hunger, disease, and malnutrition. The standard Japanese ration at the start of the war, a typical daily ration for a Japanese soldier, might include 600 to 700 grams of rice, 200 grams of barley, mixed with rice to stretch supplies, small amounts of dried fish, pickles, or soybeans, occasional vegetables. When available, tea or miso soup. This diet was filling when rice was abundant, but it lacked essential vitamins and protein. Soldiers frequently developed deficiencies, leading to diseases like beriberi, caused by a lack of vitamin B1. The jungle problem. As the war dragged on into Southeast Asia and the Pacific, supply lines collapsed. Japanese forces often operated deep behind enemy lines, cut off from resupply. In jungles where rice spoiled quickly, soldiers were forced to forage or starve. They hunted snakes, monkeys, and wild plants. Some boiled tree roots or chewed on bark to ease hunger. Malnutrition weakened entire units, leaving them vulnerable to both disease and combat exhaustion. Rice as identity. Despite the hardships, rice remained sacred. Many Japanese soldiers refused to eat foreign substitutes offered by local populations, believing rice was essential to strength and spirit. Even when half-starved, they clung to rice as a symbol of their nation and their emperor. This cultural bond to rice gave the Japanese army unity, but it also became a weakness. Their unwillingness or inability to diversify their rations meant that shortages were far deadlier for them than for other armies. The shadow of starvation. By 1944 to 45, starvation haunted Japanese troops everywhere. In places like New Guinea, soldiers were reduced to eating anything they could find. Some accounts describe soldiers so weakened that they collapsed mid-march, unable to rise again. American soldiers, by contrast, often encountered abandoned Japanese camps littered with rice sacks, spoiled, moldy, and crawling with insects. What had once been a proud staple of the Japanese soldier spirit had become a tragic reminder of their logistical failures. The cost of hunger killed more Japanese soldiers than bullets. Malnutrition and disease weakened divisions, broke morale, and decimated entire garrisons stranded on islands. By the end of the war, the rice diet of the Japanese army stood as both a testament to cultural tradition and a symbol of devastating neglect. But what did food actually look like day to day on the front lines, no matter which army you fought for? Away from ration lists and supply depots, what did a soldier really eat in the mud, the snow, or the jungle? In the trenches, what daily meals really looked like? Picture the front lines. Mud, blood, and exhaustion. A soldier huddles in a dugout, his stomach gnawing with hunger. Ration lists and official menus mean little here. What matters is what he actually has in his pack, what the supply trucks manage to deliver, and what hasn't spoiled in the rain or heat. Daily meals for soldiers were rarely regular, rarely satisfying, and almost never fresh. They were improvised, eaten in haste, and often cold. Yet these meals shaped morale as much as victories or defeats. The reality of field eating for most soldiers, the daily rhythm went something like this. Breakfast. If supplies allowed, a small portion of bread or biscuits, maybe jam, maybe coffee or tea. More often, breakfast was whatever a man had saved from the day before. Midday meal, field kitchens, if they could get close enough, served soups, stews, or tinned meat. In combat zones, this often never arrived, leaving soldiers with cold rations. Evening meal, the heaviest ration of the day when possible. For Americans, this might mean heating sea rations. For Germans, a ladle of eintopf stew. For Soviets, watery cabbage soup. For Japanese, rice with pickles if supplies held. In reality, soldiers ate when they could, not when they wanted. Hours of marching, digging, and fighting might pass before the next bite of food. Cold, wet, and repetitive soldiers remembered not just hunger but monotony. Americans grew sick of canned hash and beans. British troops cursed bully beef. Soviets longed for real bread instead of their gritty rations. Japanese soldiers, already starving, chewed rice that had gone moldy in the jungle heat. Meals were usually cold. Fire meant smoke, and smoke meant giving away your position. Soldiers often ate straight from tins, squatting in the mud, surrounded by the stench of gunpowder and sweat. When food became treasure, anything fresh was gold. An onion, a potato, or a loaf of real bread could spark cheers. Soldiers shared cigarettes, chocolate, or candy like priceless jewels. When supply trucks brought oranges or apples, they vanished in seconds. One American veteran recalled how a chocolate bar in the Ardennes felt like a miracle in foil. A Soviet soldier described finding half a sack of potatoes as better than ammunition. Food was hope, and hope kept men alive. Sharing and swapping where armies met, barter flourished. British soldiers traded tea for American cigarettes and chocolate. Soviets eagerly accepted U.S. spam from Lend-Lease. Even enemies sometimes exchanged food in unofficial truces, snatching moments of humanity in the middle of chaos. Hunger, as the silent enemy hunger, never left the trenches. It gnawed at soldiers during long marches, made them weak during attacks, and haunted them in freezing nights. Even those who weren't starving often went to bed unsatisfied. In some campaigns, Stalingrad, New Guinea, Burma, hunger was deadlier than bullets. More than just eating to eat in the trenches was to fight another battle, one of endurance. Soldiers didn't dream of medals or speeches. They dreamed of warm bread, a hot stew, or a cup of coffee that tasted like home. And when rations ran out, men turned to ingenuity. They bartered, scavenged, and even stole. Entire black markets sprang up in camps and occupied cities, feeding not just soldiers but the war itself. Black markets, barter, and the soldiers' ingenuity war breeds shortages. Shortages breed desperation, and desperation gives birth to black markets. Behind the front lines of World War II, while generals plotted strategies and politicians made speeches, an underground economy thrived. An economy of cigarettes, chocolate, bread, and coffee. For soldiers, this wasn't crime. It was survival. The rise of the black market, no matter how well-planned, official rations were never enough. Supply lines broke, tins spoiled, shipments were stolen, and hungry men were left wanting more. Black markets filled the gap. In every occupied city, Paris, Warsaw, Rome, Manila, shadowy figures offered food in exchange for cash, valuables, or favors. Soldiers quickly became both customers and suppliers. An American GI with access to canned meat or cigarettes could trade them for fresh eggs, bread, or wine from civilians. A German soldier might use army-issue schnapps to buy butter or sausages from farmers. For civilians, soldiers were not just protectors or occupiers, they were walking access points to rare goods. Cigarettes, the war's true currency of all the items traded. None was more valuable than cigarettes. They became the universal currency of World War II. One pack could buy a hot meal. A carton might secure boots or even favors from local officials. For many soldiers, cigarettes weren't just smoked. They were banknotes, bribes, and bargaining chips. Veterans often joked, "We didn't fight for freedom, we fought for lucky strikes." Soldiers' ingenuity in the field when official rations failed, ingenuity took over. Soldiers learned to stretch food, mixing powdered soup with scraps of bread to make it feel filling. Scavenge, raiding abandoned farms, fields, or warehouses. Cook creatively, using helmets as cooking pots or making stoves out of tin cans. Improvise recipes. British troops joked about bully beef curry, mixing corned beef with whatever spices or vegetables they could find. Americans made foxhole stew from tinned meat and crackers. In the Pacific, Japanese soldiers were ordered to forage when supplies ran dry, picking wild plants, fishing rivers, even stripping bark from trees to boil into soup. Some survived. Many did not. The risk of trading bartering wasn't without danger. Commanders discouraged soldiers from relying on civilians. Too much trade meant smuggling, corruption, and sometimes betrayal. In occupied territories, Being caught trading with locals could bring harsh punishment or accusations of collaboration. Yet hunger and boredom often outweighed the risks. Food as a connection beyond necessity, black markets and barter created strange bonds. Soldiers shared meals with civilians, swapping stories along with bread. Even across enemy lines, hunger sometimes softened hearts. In moments of uneasy truce, food was exchanged quietly. One side tossing over cigarettes, the other responding with bread or sausage. It was proof that, even in the bloodiest war in history, a shared meal could still remind men of their humanity. But for soldiers dreaming of home, nothing mattered more than the food waiting for them after the war. The thought of real bread, hot coffee, and a family table was enough to keep them marching. Coming home, food, memory, and the longing for normal life, the guns finally fell silent. Cities lay in ruins, millions were dead, and soldiers began the long road home. But even after years of hardship, what many remembered most vividly wasn't the sound of shells or the sight of destruction. It was the food, or rather, the lack of it. For veterans of World War II, food became more than a memory. It was a symbol of survival, a measure of what they had endured, and a reminder of what peace finally meant. The dream of a home-cooked meal throughout the war, soldiers dreamed of one thing above all: a home-cooked meal. Letters from the front often spoke not of battles but of pies, roasts, and steaming cups of coffee. Men in frozen foxholes wrote about fried chicken and mashed potatoes. Prisoners of war sketched pictures of meals they longed to eat. When they finally returned home, sitting down at the family table was often the most emotional moment. A hot meal wasn't just food. It was proof that the nightmare had ended. How rations shaped veterans' memories for decades after the war. Veterans could recall with painful detail what they ate in uniform. Some laughed about it. Americans joked about Spam, while British soldiers cursed bully beef with a grin. Others grew quiet, remembering hunger that never seemed to fade. In reunions and memoirs, talk of food was constant. One U.S. veteran once said, "We fought Hitler with beans in our stomach and Spam in our pockets." A Soviet survivor of Stalingrad whispered that even 50 years later, he could not look at a piece of black bread without remembering starvation. Food as healing. Post-war governments understood the importance of food. Soldiers were welcomed with feasts, parades, and banquets. Rationing continued for civilians in many countries, but veterans were often given priority for fresh supplies. Food became a way of honoring their service, of saying, "You made it through. You deserve this." Many veterans carried habits with them for the rest of their lives. Some hoarded canned goods in their kitchens. Others salted food heavily, remembering tasteless rations. Many never wasted a single crumb, teaching their children the value of every bite. Food as memory, food as identity. World War II was not just fought with weapons but with calories. Every loaf of bread, every tin of meat, every spoonful of rice was part of the struggle. For the men who endured it, food became inseparable from memory. To eat again in peace was to reclaim life. To drink coffee at dawn without fear of bombs. To slice bread without worry of hunger. These were victories just as real as battles won. The final bite. So, what did a soldier eat in World War II? The answer is simple and complicated all at once. They ate what their governments could supply, what black markets could provide, what their ingenuity could create, and, most importantly, what kept them alive for one more day. Food in the war was never just food. It was hope. It was survival. It was the taste of home, waiting on the other side of fear. And for millions of soldiers who returned, the memory of those rations would stay with them for the rest of their lives.